The glare from the repair shop's overhead lights felt harsh against my eyes as the technician slid my daughter's laptop toward me, his expression tight enough to make my stomach drop. I remember my fingers trembling before I even saw the screen, as if my body already knew something my mind wasn't ready to face. And the moment those hidden folders opened, it felt like the air was punched out of my lungs. If you've ever trusted the wrong person, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. You'd be surprised how many of us carry stories like this in silence. I stood there staring at the evidence, feeling my entire life tilt under my feet, knowing nothing would ever go back to the way it was. Let me show you how it all began. I still remember the way my stomach dropped that afternoon, standing in the corner of a tiny repair shop while the technician pulled up the files from my laptop. I had taken it in for what I thought was a simple issue, a frozen screen, a few glitches, nothing more. But the moment he looked at me with that uneasy expression, I felt something inside me shift. He told me I should take a seat, and even before he turned the screen toward me, I sensed that whatever he found wasn't just technical, it was personal. It was dangerous. When I finally saw what had been sitting on that laptop, hidden under layers of folders I never created, my entire world tilted. Images, screenshots, messages full of lies I never wrote, and financial records tied to my name that I had never touched. I felt my breath thinning as I realized I wasn't just looking at a betrayal. I was looking at the start of a nightmare I never saw coming. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of how any of this was even possible. How long had this been happening behind my back? Who had been using my name, my accounts, my life? That moment was the breaking point. The moment everything I trusted started to unravel. And to understand how my life reached that crossroads, I have to take you back to where all of this truly began. I used to think my life was simple, even if it wasn't always easy. I worked steady hours at a small clinic in town, coming home most evenings to a quiet house and a cup of tea that helped me settle my thoughts. After my mother passed, I inherited her home along with a modest savings account she hoped would give me some breathing room. I guarded that inheritance closely, not because it was a fortune, but because it was the last piece of her I had left. My daughter, Emily, moved back in with me a little over a year ago. She was always bright and restless, the kind of person who chased new ideas faster than she could finish the ones before them. I tried to give her space, hoping she would eventually find her footing. Some days she seemed motivated, talking about future plans, and other days she shut herself away for hours. I brushed it off as growing pains, the kind of emotional drift that happens when young adults are still figuring out who they are. Looking back, there were small moments that should have made me pause. Times when she seemed too protective of my laptop. Times when she asked oddly specific questions about my accounts. Times when she pulled away just before I walked into a room, as if she needed a second to compose herself. At the time, I convinced myself they were harmless quirks, nothing worth worrying about. My days slipped into a familiar rhythm: work, errands, checking on bills, keeping the house in order. I told myself stability was enough. But beneath that calm surface, there was a quiet tension I couldn't quite name, like I was waiting for something to shift without knowing what that something was. And things did shift, just not in the way I ever expected. It started when someone new crossed into our lives, someone who seemed harmless at first. I didn't know then that his arrival would change everything. I met Daniel on a day that felt like every other in my quiet routine. I was standing in line at the grocery store after work, tired and distracted, trying to remember if I had enough coffee at home. He was ahead of me, making small talk with the cashier, and for some reason his voice carried a warmth that pulled me out of my thoughts. When he turned and smiled at me, it felt strangely disarming, like someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. I didn't think much of it at first. A kind stranger, a pleasant moment. But life has a way of placing people in front of you just when you've started convincing yourself you don't need anyone. He showed up again a week later at the farmer's market, recognizing me immediately. He said it felt natural to talk to me, and I remember feeling both flattered and hesitant. It had been a long time since someone looked at me as if I mattered. Over the next few weeks, we crossed paths more often, sometimes by chance, sometimes in ways that felt almost intentional, though I didn't question it then. He had a gentleness about him, a way of listening that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. I found myself opening up, slowly, cautiously, telling him little pieces of my life, my work, my worries about making ends meet, my hopes for Emily. He seemed genuinely interested, and I let myself believe it. There were tiny moments that should have made me pause. Times when he asked about my finances with a curiosity that felt a bit too pointed, or when he reacted just a little too strongly to stories about Emily. But I brushed those thoughts aside. I wanted to believe that maybe, after so long, I had finally met someone kind. I didn't know then that everything was already shifting. And it wasn't long after Daniel became a regular presence in my life that the issue with Emily's laptop began to surface. An issue that would change everything. When I walked back into that repair shop, I could feel something was off before anyone said a word. The air felt heavy, like the room itself was bracing for impact. The technician stood near the counter with my daughter's laptop already open, and the moment he looked at me, a strange chill moved through my chest. It was the kind of look people give when they're about to hand you news that will change everything. He didn't have to say anything. I could read the worry in his face. When he turned the screen toward me, I felt my pulse quicken. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Rows of emails, financial dashboards, accounts I didn't recognize. My name was everywhere, attached to transfers, authorizations, and conversations I had never seen in my life. As I scrolled, the dread settled in slowly, like cold water rising around my ankles. And then the realization hit me so hard it felt physical. These weren't just mistakes or spam or harmless errors. Someone had been using my identity. Someone had been planning something behind my back, using my name, my information, my trust. And the deeper I looked, the more it became clear that this wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was close. It was personal. My hands started to shake as I pieced the fragments together. Odd questions my daughter had asked, her sudden protectiveness over the laptop, the strange tension in the house. Each memory twisted into something darker. The shock turned into heartbreak, and the heartbreak into a hollow kind of horror. But beneath all that pain, something else began to form, a steadiness, a quiet, sharpening resolve. If someone thought they could destroy my life in secret, they were about to learn how wrong they were. And that was the moment I knew I had to plan my next move. When I got home, I set the printed pages from the repair shop on my dining table and just stared at them. The house felt different, almost unfamiliar, as if the walls themselves knew something I didn't. The first wave of emotion hit hard. Grief. disbelief, the kind of hurt that makes your chest tighten. I let myself feel it, because pretending it didn't matter would have been a lie. This betrayal wasn't abstract. It had my name on it, my accounts, my life. But after the initial collapse, something inside me began to settle. Not in resignation, more like clarity slowly rising to the surface. I picked up each sheet carefully, studying the dates, the transfers, the archived messages. I realized that if I wanted to survive this, I needed to be methodical. I needed to think, not react. So I gathered everything: screenshots, statements, even the technician's notes. I backed up the files to an external drive I kept locked away. Then I went through my accounts one by one, tightening passwords, enabling alerts, moving what little savings I had into a separate place only I controlled. Every step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Still, I knew I couldn't navigate this alone. There was one person I trusted completely, an old coworker, someone steady and level-headed. I reached out quietly, not with details, but with a simple request to meet soon. I needed someone who could help me think through this without judgment or panic. By the time evening settled in, the fear had shifted into something sharper. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't helpless. If anything, I felt more focused than I had in years, and I knew this was only the beginning. I had to keep calm, act normal, and follow the trail deeper if I wanted to uncover the truth. Pretending everything was normal became its own kind of performance, one I had to perfect if I wanted to understand how deep this deception really went. When Daniel stopped by the house, I greeted him the same way I always had, but inside I was measuring every word, every glance, every change in his tone. There was a subtle eagerness in him now, as if he were waiting for something, and once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Around Emily, the shift felt even sharper. I watched her movements more closely, how she hovered near the hallway when my phone buzzed, how she stiffened whenever I entered the room unexpectedly, how her eyes darted toward my purse a little too often. These were habits I would have ignored before, but now they formed a pattern I couldn't deny. There was guilt in her silence, and fear tucked into the way she avoided my gaze. The hardest part was staying calm. I could feel anger simmering beneath my ribs, but I forced myself to breathe, to smile, to act as though I was still the person they thought I was. Every moment became an exercise in restraint. I listened more than I spoke. I noted the small inconsistencies in their stories, the pressured suggestions, the manufactured warmth that once felt genuine. At night, I documented everything: dates, behaviors, suspicious moments, building a quiet record of what was happening inside my own home. It felt surreal, gathering evidence against people I had invited into my life with an open heart. But I knew I was getting closer to the truth. Their tension was rising, and Daniel had started hinting at some opportunity he thought I should consider. The way he spoke about it carried the same practiced warmth he used the day we met. I could feel the next phase approaching, and I was ready to step into it. Daniel brought up the investment idea one evening with a confidence that almost felt rehearsed. He spoke about it like it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, something small enough to sound manageable but promising enough to tempt someone who didn't fully understand the risks. I listened carefully, nodding at the right moments, pretending his enthusiasm was contagious. Inside, though, I was studying every word, every gesture, every pause. I wanted to understand exactly how he planned to take what wasn't his. He showed me property photos on his phone, screenshots of documents that looked official at first glance, and a timeline he insisted was time-sensitive. I acted intrigued, asking him quiet questions, just enough to keep up the illusion without revealing what I already knew. The more he talked, the more obvious his strategy became. Pressure, urgency, flattery. It was a pattern I'd seen in those emails on Emily's laptop. While he explained the profit structure, I was already calculating my next steps. That week, I met with my attorney under the pretense of updating my will. In reality, we discussed the documents Daniel had given me, mapped out a timeline, and aligned my schedule with the investigators I had quietly contacted. I made sure every file he sent me was duplicated and stored safely. Each time we visited a property he claimed was part of the deal, I treated it like a performance. I walked through the rooms, asked about potential renovations, even complimented his eye for opportunity. But inside, I was cataloging inconsistencies, the unrealistic price, the missing permits, the vague ownership details. By the time he suggested setting a date for the final transfer, he was convinced he had me exactly where he wanted me. What he didn't realize was that I was the one preparing the stage for what would happen next. Walking into the staged title office felt like stepping into the center of a storm I had quietly built myself. The room looked ordinary enough. Neutral walls, a tidy desk, a stack of crisp documents waiting for signatures. But my pulse was steady only because I had rehearsed this moment again and again. When I handed over the cashier's checks, I watched Daniel out of the corner of my eye. He carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, the kind a person only has when they believe victory is guaranteed. He thought he had already won. Inside, though, I felt an unexpected calm. I knew every movement was being recorded. I knew every dollar was traceable. I knew this was the final act of a script he didn't realize I had rewritten. Later that evening, I invited him and Emily over for dinner. I cooked as if nothing in my world had shifted, even though everything had. I set the table, lit a candle, and let them settle in like it was any ordinary night. But when I finally let the mask slip, just enough for Daniel to sense something was wrong, I saw the first flicker of fear in his eyes. The knock on the door came seconds later. Agents moved in quickly, voices firm but controlled. I stepped back as they placed Daniel in handcuffs, then turned toward Emily. Seeing her hands shake, seeing her face pale, broke something inside me. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was a hollow kind of ache that settled deep in my chest. As they were let out, I stood in the quiet of my own home, the air still trembling with everything that had just unfolded. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, that there was a darker truth waiting just beyond this moment. When the house finally fell silent after the arrests, an investigator asked me to sit down. I remember the look on his face. It wasn't the firm confidence he'd carried through the sting. It was something heavier. When he explained what they had uncovered, the floor seemed to shift beneath me. Emily hadn't been acting out of ambition or selfishness. She had been pulled into a network Daniel was working with, cornered by debts she never told me about, and threatened in ways she felt too ashamed and terrified to admit. As he talked, pieces of the past months rearranged themselves into a different picture. The secrecy, the fear in her eyes, the strange questions. She hadn't just been helping him. She had been trapped, manipulated, slowly stripped of choices until she believed betraying me was her only way out. Hearing that tore something open inside me. The anger I'd been holding cracked into sorrow so sharp it felt like a physical wound. I wanted to be furious with her, but all I could feel was heartbreak for the danger she had been carrying alone. Nothing about this was simple anymore. The path ahead wasn't about punishment. It was about understanding and rebuilding what fear had broken, and I knew the real work was just beginning. In the days that followed, the shock slowly gave way to something quieter, a mix of grief, relief, and a fragile kind of clarity. Once the investigators explained everything, I knew I couldn't carry anger toward Emily. She was still responsible for the choices she made, but she had also been a frightened young woman trying to navigate threats she never should have faced alone. I made the decision to support her through supervised recovery, letting the professionals guide her while I focused on healing myself. I started small. I cleaned out the rooms that had felt heavy for months, opened the windows, and let fresh air in. I rearranged my furniture, repainted a wall, even planted herbs outside my kitchen door. These tiny shifts grounded me, reminding me that my home and my life could still be mine. I picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned, like morning walks and journaling before work. I reached out to friends I hadn't spoken to in too long, letting myself reconnect without shame. And slowly, I noticed a strength returning, not loud or dramatic, but steady, real. Emily and I began talking again, carefully, honestly, with boundaries that protected us both. It wasn't easy, but it felt like rebuilding something worth keeping. And as I moved through those weeks, I felt a new sense of direction forming, one I knew I needed to share before closing this story. Looking back now, I can see how every moment, every shock, every heartbreak, every hard truth forced me to grow in ways I never expected. I learned that trust needs boundaries, that love can coexist with accountability, and that resilience doesn't always look like strength on the outside. Sometimes it's just choosing to get up, breathe, and take the next small step forward. I also learned something about my own worth. For so long, I moved through life quietly, trying not to ask for too much. But this ordeal taught me that my voice matters, my safety matters, and my peace matters. Rebuilding myself wasn't about pretending nothing happened. It was about honoring what did and deciding I deserved better moving forward. My relationship with Emily is still healing, but it's honest now, and I'm learning to build my life with more intention, more clarity, more self-respect, more courage. There's a strange kind of beauty in that. If you've ever lived through something that shook your world apart, I hope you know you're not alone. Healing takes time, but it's possible, one steady breath at a time. If you feel comfortable, share your story in the comments. I read everyone, and your voice might help someone else feel a little less alone.